Rian had always believed that life in the border town would stay the same forever. His days usually began before the sun came up, when the air still felt cool and the workshop smelled like dust and old metal. He would unlock the rusty door of his small repair shop, stretch his back, and stand for a moment in the quiet morning. It was the only time of day when the town wasn't full of noise, no shouting traders, no loud engines, no tired travelers asking for quick repairs. Just silence and the soft hum of machines that never really turned off. Most people in town didn't notice him much. To them, he was just the human who fixed broken engines, patched old hover bikes, and worked late into the night without complaining. He didn't have many friends, but he liked it that way. He preferred the company of tools and quiet moments rather than gossip or arguments. That evening, he was staying later than usual. A customer had left a cargo bike in terrible shape, and Rian wanted to finish it before morning. The lights in the shop flickered softly, throwing long shadows across the floor. The heater buzzed. The smell of oil filled the air and outside. The wind pushed dust across the street. Not everything felt normal until he heard it. Small sound like something scraping along metal dot at first. Rian ignored it. The workshop always made strange noises. Loose sheets of iron moved when the wind blew. Pipes creaked, tools settled. But then came another sound. A soft whine, almost like a cry. Rian put down his wrench and listened carefully. There it was again. A small, shaky sound, coming from behind the wall of scrap metal behind the building. Someone or something was out there. He slowly walked toward the back door, wiping his hands on his shirt. The noise grew clearer with every step. It didn't sound dangerous. In fact, it sounded. Scared, he opened the back door just a little and peered outside. The night was cold, and the lights from the street didn't reach the back of the shop. Only the moon lit the piles of metal and broken parts stacked around him. For a moment, he thought maybe he imagined it. But then he heard it again, 2 small whines, so soft and tired that they pulled at his heart. He stepped outside. The ground felt cold, and the smell of rust was even stronger. Rian moved slowly, careful not to scare whatever was hiding. He pushed aside a broken metal frame, and then a discarded engine cover. That's when he saw them. 2 tiny creatures curled up together, shivering. They were no bigger than house cats, their small bodies pressed close for warmth. Their scales were dusty and dull, their wings folded tightly against their sides. One had a small injury on its leg, nothing bleeding, just scraped and swollen. The other looked hungry, its little stomach flat from lack of food. They were dragons. Baby dragons. Refugees, most likely. Many families had been fleeing from the unrest happening far beyond the mountains. Everyone in town had heard the stories groups traveling through forests, hiding in caves, trying to find safety. But Rian had never expected any of them to end up in his scrapyard. The babies looked up at him. Their eyes were huge, round, and full of fear. They didn't move. They didn't growl or hiss. They just watched him, waiting for what he would do. Rian felt his breath catch. Dragons, even little ones, were rare here. People didn't welcome them. If the authorities found out, they would remove them immediately. Some people believed dragons were dangerous. Others believed they didn't belong in human territories. And most simply didn't want any trouble. Rian didn't want trouble either. But the sight of the 2 tiny creatures made his chest tighten. They looked so helpless, so tired, as if they had been walking for days. Their wings were dusty, their small claws dull and cracked. They looked like they hadn't eaten properly in a long time. Rian crouched down slowly. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you." The injured one flinched, but the other only blinked at him, as if deciding whether or not to trust him. Rian didn't want to scare them more, so he looked around for something he could offer. He remembered the leftover food he had inside half a sandwich, a small pack of dried fruit. Nothing special, but better than nothing. He got up and went inside the shop. His hands shook a little, not from fear, but from the unexpectedness of it all. He grabbed what food he had and poured some clean water into a metal bowl. When he returned outside, the dragons were still there, eyes locked on him. Rian placed the food gently in front of them and stepped back. At first, they didn't move. They stared at the food, then at him, unsure. Slowly, the less frightened ones sniffed the air. It took one tiny step forward, then another. When it reached the sandwich, it glanced at Rian one last time before taking a small bite. The moment it tasted the food, its eyes widened. Hunger took over, and it began eating quickly, making soft clicking sounds of relief. The other one watched for a second, before dragging itself closer and sharing the food. Rian felt a knot form in his chest. No creature should ever have to eat like that, desperate, afraid someone might take the food away. He stayed with them, keeping a good distance so they wouldn't feel threatened. The more confident dragon kept glancing at him curiously, almost as if trying to understand why a human would help them. The injured one ate slower, wincing now and then, its small legs stretching awkwardly. When they finally finished, they looked a little better, still thin, still tired, but calmer. Rian didn't know what to do next. He couldn't leave them outside in the cold. He also couldn't bring them inside, where anyone passing by might see them. But he couldn't ignore them either. Not when they clearly needed help. After a moment of thinking, he crouched down again. "You can stay behind the shop tonight," he said softly, even though he knew they couldn't understand every word. "It's safer here than out there." He brought out an old blanket and placed it near them. They sniffed it, confused but interested. Eventually, the bolder dragon climbed onto it, curling up with a small sigh. The injured one followed slowly, lying down carefully to avoid hurting its leg. Rian sat on an overturned crate nearby. Watching them relax felt strangely peaceful. The night air was cold, but a warm feeling grew inside him. He didn't know why he cared so much. Maybe it was because he had lived most of his life alone and understood what it felt like to be without help. Or maybe it was simply because kindness came naturally to him. Either way, he couldn't walk away. He stayed out there for a long time, making sure they were comfortable. The dragons slowly drifted into sleep, their breathing soft and rhythmic. The stars above shimmered gently, and the workshop lights hummed in the background. Rian sighed and leaned back against the crate. He told himself he was only helping them for the night. Just one night, he thought. By morning, he would figure out what to do. Maybe he would find a safe place to take them. Maybe someone else would know what to do. But deep down, he knew this wasn't going to be a simple one-night kindness. Something about these two little creatures had already changed. Something inside him. They were tiny strangers in a dangerous world. And he was the only person they had as he watched them sleep. Their small bodies curled tightly together, their wings covering each other like blankets. He felt a quiet promise forming in his heart. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to abandon them. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. Rian woke up the next morning earlier than usual. The sun had not fully risen yet, and the air outside felt cold and fresh. Most days, he dragged himself out of bed slowly, but today he hurried. The first thing on his mind wasn't the half-finished work in his shop. It wasn't the customers waiting. It wasn't even breakfast. It was the two little dragons sleeping behind his workshop. He splashed water on his face, wiped it with a towel, and stepped outside. His boots crunched on the dusty ground as he moved toward the back of the shop, hoping the little creatures were still there. A strange nervousness stirred in his stomach. He had never taken care of dragons before. He didn't know what they needed or how to help them. But he still hoped they had made it through the cold night. When he reached the side of the scrap pile where they slept, he stopped. The blanket he had left for them was still there, a small curled shape under it. But when he stepped closer, he realized there were actually two shapes under the blanket, two little bodies pressed tightly against each other. Their wings wrapped around their own heads, as if protecting their dreams. They were breathing softly, peacefully. A long breath escaped Rian's chest without him realizing he had been holding it. He smiled gently. Something about watching them sleep so deeply made him feel lighter inside. He didn't want to wake them, so he quietly walked back into the workshop. He packed some leftover bread, cut it into tiny pieces, warmed up the heater in the shop so it would spread warmth to the back area, and filled a bowl with water. When he returned to them, one of the dragons had already opened a sleepy eye, like it sensed him approaching. The small creature looked at Rian without any fear this time. Not trust yet, but no fear. That was enough. "Good morning," Rian whispered, placing the food nearby. The dragon blinked slowly and nudged its sibling awake. The injured one stretched in a lazy, awkward way, but it didn't make the same pained sound it made the night before. That made Rian feel even better. Maybe they were getting stronger already. The moment they smelled food, both dragons perked up. Their little wings fluttered, their tails tapped the ground gently, and they hurried toward the bread pieces. Rian stepped back again so they wouldn't feel threatened. They ate hungrily, but not as desperately as they had the previous night. They paused to look at him from time to time, almost as if checking if he was still there. The moment their eyes met his, Rian nodded softly to reassure them. For the first time, the dragons didn't flinch after finishing the food. They slowly walked toward him, cautious but curious. One of them sniffed his boot, then his hand. Their noses felt warm, their breath soft. Rian stayed completely still, letting them decide what they wanted to do. When the braver dragon finally touched his fingers with its forehead, Rian felt something small but powerful, the beginning of trust. He wasn't sure how long he sat there that morning. The town was waking up. People were sweeping their front doors, machines were starting, voices were rising. But Rian stayed behind his workshop with the dragons, watching them explore the small space, play with scraps of metal, and look around with wide eyes. He had no idea how quickly he was getting attached as the sun climbed higher. He realized he would have to open his workshop soon. People would start arriving with broken hover bikes, old machines, engines that needed fixing. He couldn't risk anyone seeing the dragons. So he carefully led them into a small corner behind the scrap pile, where the shadows stayed cool and hidden. He placed a plank of wood in front, so the space looked like part of the pile. From the outside, nobody would notice the hollow space inside. "You'll be safe here," he whispered. The dragons tilted their heads at him, listening to his voice, even if they didn't understand the words. Rian opened his workshop around the same time as always. The day passed in a blur of noise engines rumbling, tools clinking, people asking for repairs. But in the middle of all that noise, Rian's thoughts kept drifting back to the two little dragons hiding behind the shop. Every hour or so, he found a reason to step outside and check on them. Sometimes he would bring water, sometimes small pieces of food, sometimes nothing at all, just a quick look to make sure they were safe. Each time, the dragons greeted him with bright eyes and small chirps that sounded like soft, happy calls. By evening, they weren't hiding from him anymore. When he walked toward the scrap pile after closing the shop for the day, both little dragons peeked their heads out and ran to him, excited. Their tails swayed, their wings fluttered, and they made small playful sounds that made Rian smile without trying. He didn't know much about dragons, but he knew one thing: they were warming up to him faster than he expected. He sat down on the ground, legs stretched out. The braver dragon climbed onto his lap and curled up. The injured sibling rested close to his foot, leaning against it like it was a warm stone. Rian froze at first, not wanting to scare them, but when he realized they were comfortable, he slowly relaxed. The sky turned orange, then purple. Stars started appearing. The night breeze grew cool. Rian looked at the two small creatures resting around him and felt something shift inside him, a quiet understanding that life had just become very different. He didn't plan for this. He wasn't looking for anything new in his life. Yet these two small dragons had arrived without warning, like lost travelers knocking on a stranger's door, and somehow, without even speaking, they had changed the atmosphere around him. They made the lonely workshop feel less empty. They made the long, quiet nights feel less cold as the days passed. Rian found himself creating a routine for them. He woke up earlier, bought extra food from the market, and saved all the warm leftover pieces for the dragons. He fixed an old heater and placed it near the scrap pile so their hiding spot would stay warm at night. When the injured dragon had trouble walking, Rian made a small splint from soft cloth and a metal strip to support its leg. He didn't know if it was perfect, but the dragon stopped limping as much, and that was enough for him. Little by little, the dragons grew stronger. They learned to climb onto his shoulder when he carried them. They learned to play with small bolts and nuts like toys. They even learned to sit quietly behind the shop when customers came. But as they got stronger, it became harder to ignore the truth. People in the town talked a lot. Rumors spread easily here. And recently, there had been more and more talk about missing dragons, wandering dragons, unregistered creatures crossing borders. Some said they saw soldiers checking for unapproved species. Others said they heard there would be searches. Each rumor made Rian's stomach twist. He didn't know much about dragon laws. But he knew one thing for sure. These two didn't belong here. Not in this town, not hiding behind a workshop, not running from shadows. They belonged somewhere they could grow freely. But when Rian looked at them, he couldn't imagine letting them go yet. They were still too small, too trusting, too attached. They didn't understand danger. They only understood that Rian fed them, kept them warm, and stayed with them. One evening, as he fixed a broken bike, he felt a small tap on his arm. He looked down and saw one of the dragons holding a tiny screwdriver in its mouth, as if trying to help. Rian couldn't help laughing softly. He gently took the screwdriver and placed it on the bench. "You'll help me one day," he murmured. "But not yet. You're still too little." The dragon chirped happily, as if agreeing. Later that night, Rian lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He could hear the gentle sounds of the dragons shifting in their hidden space. The workshop lights were off. The street outside was quiet. But his mind wasn't. He had planned to help them for one night. Now days were turning into weeks, and he found it harder to imagine his life without them. They were becoming part of his world, part of his routine, part of his quiet evenings. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't know how long he could keep them safe. He didn't even know their real story, where they came from, what they had seen, who might be looking for them. But he knew this much. As long as they were with him, he would protect them. As long as they trusted him, he wouldn't let anything happen to them. As long as they looked at him with those big eyes full of hope, he couldn't walk away. He closed his eyes, listening to their soft breathing somewhere in the dark. He didn't know it yet, but the little bond forming between them would soon grow into something far bigger than he ever imagined. And the world outside was already changing in ways that would one day reach his quiet workshop door. The night the soldiers arrived in town was a night Rian would never forget. Even years later, he would still remember the sound first, the sharp clink of metal armor, the steady steps that felt heavier than normal boots, and the low hum of official vehicles moving through narrow streets. It was a sound that didn't belong in a small place like this. It belonged to cities, borders, and big political centers, not dusty repair shops and quiet neighbors. Rian had just finished closing his workshop. The lights were off, and only a single dim lamp glowed at the corner of the room. He was wiping grease from his hands when he heard the sound. At first he dismissed it, thinking maybe travelers were passing through. But the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, closer, and more organized, like a group moving with purpose. He froze for a moment, holding the cloth in his hand. His eyes slid toward the back of the workshop, where the two little dragons were hiding. They had been safe so far, but tonight something felt different. The air felt heavier. The silence outside was too strange. He stepped out of the front door and saw people standing on their balconies or peeking from behind windows. Everyone was confused, whispering to each other in low, nervous voices. A long vehicle with sharp white lights passed down the main road. Behind it came soldiers in dark uniforms, scanning the streets, checking corners, and speaking into small communication devices. Rian felt the knot in his stomach. Tightened dot, he knew exactly why they were here. Rumors had been spreading for weeks about border authorities searching for unregistered dragons. But seeing it with his own eyes made it real and dangerous. He quickly stepped back into his shop and locked the door. Then he walked as quietly as he could toward the back. He lifted the piece of wood covering the dragon's hiding spot and whispered urgently, "Come here." The two dragons were awake. They had already sensed the tension outside. Their wings were pulled tight against their bodies, and their eyes were wide with worry. The braver one walked out first, sniffing the air. The injured sibling followed slowly, still limping a little but stronger than before. Rian knelt beside them. "We don't have time," he whispered. His voice shook, but he tried to keep it calm. "We have to move." The dragons didn't understand the words, but they understood his tone. The braver one pressed its head against his knee, frightened. Rian gently stroked its neck. For a moment, he wished the world were kinder. He wished he could keep them hidden forever, let them grow safely in some quiet corner of his life. But this was not that kind of world. These dragons did not belong in a dusty mechanic's workshop, hiding from shadows. And now that soldiers were here, staying would only bring danger to him and to them. He went inside, grabbed a small bag, stuffed in some food, cloth, a little bandage roll, anything that might help them later. Then he put on his jacket and turned to the dragons. "We're going to take a walk," he whispered. He slowly opened the back door, peeking out first to make sure no one was around. The soldiers were on the other side of the street, checking storage units and speaking loudly to each other. This was his chance. He signaled the dragons. They slipped out quietly, their small bodies close to the ground. Their tails curled in fear, but they stayed right beside him. The three of them moved through the narrow alley behind the workshop, then toward the abandoned path leading to the mountains. Rian knew the area well. He had spent years collecting scrap from the rocky hills nearby, so he knew which routes were hidden by trees and which corners stayed quiet, even during busy hours. The night air felt colder as they walked. The dragons' breaths came out in small, shaky puffs. Rian kept glancing behind him, making sure no one was following. He heard the distant shouts of soldiers, the barking of some kind of scanning device, the clatter of metal. But slowly the sounds faded. The further they walked, the more silent the world became. When they finally reached the rocky path that led toward the mountains, Rian stopped. The moonlight made the ground look silver. The sky was clear, sprinkled with stars that made the world feel larger and quieter than usual. He kneeled on the dirt and motioned the dragons to come closer. They moved to him immediately, pressing against him for warmth and reassurance. It took a moment before he could find the right words. "You can't stay with me anymore?" he said. Softly the dragon's bodies tensed at his voice. Braver one let out a soft sound, a tiny chirp filled with confusion. The injured sibling lowered its head, sensing something sad. Rian touched their backs gently, running his hand down their scales. He felt their fragile little bodies, warm and trembling. His heart ached seeing them like that. He wished he could lie and tell them everything was fine, that they could go back to the shop and sleep under the blanket. But lies wouldn't protect them. "There are soldiers," he whispered. "They'll search every place. They'll find you if you stay." The braver dragon climbed onto his lap, pressing its forehead against his chest as if asking to stay. Rian held it tightly, closing his eyes for a moment to steady himself. "I'm not sending you away forever," he said softly. "Just somewhere safe." He pointed toward the dark line of mountains in the distance. Beyond those mountains was a forest that stretched toward dragon territory. If the little dragons could reach it, they might find their own kind others who could protect them. "I'll guide you to the edge," he whispered. "But you have to go the rest of the way yourselves." The dragons didn't understand everything, but they understood the feeling in his voice. They looked between him and the mountains. Their wings trembled. Rian lifted the injured dragon gently and adjusted the small splint around its leg. He tied a fresh piece of cloth around it to give more support. The dragon whined softly but didn't pull away. It trusted him completely. "Just a little more," he told them. They kept walking together, slowly and carefully, until they reached the point where the path narrowed into a place only small creatures could pass through. Trees formed a natural wall, and the sound of the town was gone. All they heard now were crickets, soft leaves rustling, and the quiet heartbeat of the night. Rian stopped walking. "This is as far as I can go," he whispered. The braver dragon stepped up to him, pressing its head into his hand. Rian stroked it gently. The injured one climbed onto his foot and curled around it like it always did when it wanted comfort. His throat tightened painfully. He never planned to care so much. He never planned to let two tiny creatures take up so much space in his life. But now the thought of letting them go felt like something breaking inside. Still, he knelt down and gathered them both into a hug. They were warm and soft, their scales brushing against his jacket. "I love you both like family," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "But if you stay, they'll take you. And I won't let that happen." The braver dragon chirped weakly. The injured one nudged his hand with its nose. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to walk away into the unknown. Rian swallowed hard. "You'll grow," he whispered. "You'll learn to fly. You'll become strong. Stronger than anything in this world. I know you will." He gently turned them toward the dark path leading into the trees. "Go," he whispered. They didn't move. Rian forced a smile, even though his eyes were burning. "I'll be okay," he said softly. "I promise. Now go." The braver dragon took one tiny step, then another. The injured one followed slowly. They kept looking back at him, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Rian lifted his hand and waved. "Go," he said again, his voice barely above a breath. The dragons hesitated one last time, then disappeared into the shadows of the trees, their small shapes swallowed by the night. Rian stood there long after they were gone. His breath came out shaky. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark entrance where he last saw them. He didn't move until the sky began to lighten. Deep down he knew they were safe now, but he had no way of knowing if he would ever see them again. He only knew one thing. That night, he had said goodbye to the two creatures who had become the most important part of his quiet life. And somewhere in the darkness of the forest, the little dragons were carrying his kindness with them. They didn't know it yet, but their promise to return softly whispered the last night they stayed with him was a promise the world would make sure they remembered. The day the Empress Guard entered the workshop changed the air of the whole place. Even after they left, the silence stayed like a thick fog. The human mechanic stood in the center of the dusty floor, his hands still trembling from the shock of what he had just heard. For 5 years, he had lived a simple life repairing engines, patching up old flyers, and occasionally wondering what happened to the 2 little dragons he had fed on that stormy night. He never imagined that those small creatures would grow up somewhere far away and remember him. And he never imagined the Empress Guard would walk in carrying their message. After the soldiers left, he locked the workshop door and leaned against it for a long moment. It felt unreal. He thought the memory of that night would have faded for both sides, for him and the dragons. They were small, scared, cold, and hungry. He simply offered food, warmth, and a place to sleep. To him, it was just kindness. To them, apparently, it was something much greater. As evening approached, he tried to work on an engine that had been sitting half-finished for days, but his hands kept slowing down. His mind kept replaying the guard's words. The young heirs have requested you. They have searched for years. They consider you part of their life debt. The words felt heavier each time. He made his way to the small room upstairs where he slept. It was simple. An old mattress, a single shelf with tools he never used, and a window that overlooked the dusty road leading out of the town. He sat near the window and watched the fading sunlight paint the clouds orange. Travelers moved in and out, unaware that someone among them had suddenly become important to an empire he barely understood. Night came slowly, and sleep came even slower. He kept asking himself questions he had no answers to. Why would they want me? What do they expect from me? Will going there change my life forever? And what if I don't go? The next morning he woke early and stepped outside the workshop. The market streets were waking up around him. People carried baskets, merchants prepared their stalls, and machines hummed from workshops. Everything looked normal, yet he felt like he no longer belonged to this normal life. He decided to visit old Farron, a neighbor who had known him since he arrived 5 years ago. Farron was older, with gray hair tied back in a rough knot and hands always covered in metal grease. When the mechanic explained what happened, the older man listened quietly without interrupting. After the story ended, Farron let out a long breath and tapped his fingers on the table. You helped someone when you had nothing to gain, Farron said. Maybe now the world is returning that kindness, but only you can choose if you'll step into it. The mechanic nodded, but his mind was still unsettled. He didn't feel like a hero or someone special. He felt like a man who once shared food with 2 frightened creatures, because no one else would. He returned to the workshop, but instead of starting repairs, he opened the small metal box under his workbench. Inside it were his savings coins and notes collected over the years, enough for a simple life, but not for adventures. He ran his fingers through them and wondered if soon he would leave this little town behind. Around midday, the same Empress Guard unit returned. Their leader stepped forward politely and asked if he was ready to travel. He asked them for a little more time, and surprisingly, they agreed. They said the heirs would wait for him, and that his decision mattered greatly to them. That made his heart feel even heavier. For the rest of the day, he packed slowly. He folded shirts, tools, and the few personal things he owned. Every item reminded him of how long he had lived in this quiet place. It wasn't the life he dreamed of, but it was a life he understood. The idea of flying across sectors to meet the Empress's heirs, who might now be powerful, respected, and nothing like the scared little dragons he once knew, felt overwhelming. Evening arrived again. This time, instead of sitting by the window, he walked down the town's main road. He watched families eating together outside, children running in circles, and vendors closing their stalls. He imagined what his life would look like if he stayed. It would be safe, predictable, and quiet. But something inside him whispered that maybe he wasn't meant to stay safe and small forever. The next dawn came with a pale, soft light. He woke before the sun fully rose and stepped outside. The air smelled like a new beginning. Birds circled in the sky, and the road looked different today, like it was calling him somewhere far away. The Empress Guard arrived exactly on time. Their leader looked at him with calm eyes and asked once more, "Have you decided?" The mechanic looked back at his workshop, the scratches on the door, the dusty windows, the engine parts he had spent years working on. He thought about the 2 little dragons he once fed. He wondered how they looked now, grown, strong, alive because of him. He felt a mix of fear and hope. But something inside made him step forward. He told the guard he would go. The soldiers bowed slightly and guided him to their transport. As the vehicle lifted off, the town became smaller beneath him. He pressed his hand against the window and watched the life he knew fade into the distance. The journey was long, filled with silent moments and unfamiliar stars. He didn't know what waited for him at the other end, but he felt the world shifting around him. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was someone remembered, someone requested, someone important to 2 dragons who had never forgotten kindness. And as the transport flew toward the heart of the empire, he sensed that what awaited him would change everything more than he could imagine. The transport glided through the star-filled sky for hours, but the mechanic barely noticed the time. His thoughts kept circling around one question. What would the dragons look like now? Would they even remember him the same way he remembered them? He felt caught between excitement and fear, like someone walking into a future they did not ask for but could not avoid. When the ship finally slowed down, he saw something that made his breath catch. Floating above the clouds was a massive city built with shining metal towers, soft glowing lights, and bridges that curved like silver threads. This was the capital home of the Empress and the heart of the empire. He had seen drawings of it in old books, but the real thing looked almost unreal, like a dream someone shaped with careful hands. The transport landed on a quiet platform. The moment the doors opened, warm air rushed in, carrying a scent he could not name, something like flowers mixed with the smell of engine oil. The Empress Guard formed a respectful circle around him and guided him toward a long hallway filled with soft blue lights. Everything around him felt polished, elegant, and far beyond the simple life he had lived. As they walked, he kept expecting someone to stop him and say there had been a mistake. He was just a mechanic, not someone important enough to walk through these fancy halls. But no one questioned him. Instead, everyone who passed gave him a polite nod, as though they knew who he was and why he was here. After what felt like a long walk, the doors at the end of the hall opened slowly. The guard stepped aside, silently asking him to enter alone. His heart thumped as he walked in. The room was large but peaceful, with tall windows showing the city and the sky beyond it. There were carvings on the walls, depictions of dragons in different stages of their lives. But the most surprising thing in the room were the 2 figures waiting near the center. They were dragons, but not the tiny, hungry ones he remembered. These dragons stood tall, graceful, and strong. Their scales had a soft shine, their wings folded neatly behind them, and their eyes, those eyes still had the same gentle brightness he had seen 5 years ago. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then one of the dragons stepped forward with slow, careful steps. When it spoke, its voice was deep but warm, almost unsure. "You came." The mechanic felt a strange tightness in his throat, but he managed to nod. "Yes, I came." The second dragon moved closer, its eyes soft, the way a child looks at someone they trust completely. "We did not know if you would," it said quietly. "We were afraid you had forgotten us." He almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because of how impossible it was. "Forgotten you?" I thought about you both so many times. I just never expected this." The dragons exchanged a look that seemed full of meaning. Then the first dragon said, "When we were young and hiding on your world, we had nothing. No food, no shelter, no safety. Many people feared us. Some pushed us away, but you saw two frightened creatures and gave us food. You shared warmth. You protected us without asking who we were." The second dragon stepped closer until its large head was inches from him. "In our culture, that creates a life debt. It means our lives were changed by your goodness. And we never forgot that night. Not even for a single day." He swallowed hard, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of their words. He had never thought of himself as someone who saved lives. To him, it had been a simple act feeding two scared beings who needed help. But to them, it had shaped their destiny. The first dragon lowered its head respectfully. "We searched for you for years after the war ended. When we finally learned your name, we asked the Empress Guard to bring you here. Not because we want to repay a debt with wealth or gifts, but because you are part of our story now." The mechanic took a slow breath. "What do you want from me?" The two dragons looked at each other again, then back at him. The second one spoke with a gentleness that surprised him. "We want you to stay. Not as a servant. Not as someone to work for us. We want you to stay as family." The word hit him like a soft but powerful force. Family. It had been years since anyone used that word in connection with him. He had lived alone for so long, repairing machines and keeping to himself. Hearing it now felt strange but warm, like something he didn't realize he needed. He sat down quietly on a bench nearby, letting the emotion settle. "Why me?" he whispered. The dragons moved closer, lowering themselves to sit at his level. The first dragon spoke softly. "Because when we had no one, you were the one who didn't turn away." The second dragon added, "And because kindness shapes more than empires. It shapes hearts. Ours were shaped by you." There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, like a moment that didn't need words. Finally, the mechanic lifted his head. "I don't know if I belong in a place like this," he admitted. "I don't know anything about your world." The dragons exchanged a small smile. "We will teach you," the first one said, "and learn from you. That is what family does." Something inside him loosened, something he had carried for years without noticing. The thought of returning to his small workshop suddenly felt empty. That life had been a safe place for a time, but maybe he had outgrown it without realizing. He looked at the dragons, once tiny and trembling, now tall and strong. They remembered him not as a stranger who helped, but as someone important. He felt a slow warmth fill his chest. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll stay." The two dragons bowed their heads with happiness, so clear it almost felt like sunlight filling the room. One of them extended a wing, gently touching his shoulder, a gesture of welcome in their culture dot. In the days that followed, his life transformed. He was given a small home inside the palace, close to the dragons. They visited him every morning, showing him the city, teaching him their customs, and sharing stories of their journey. He learned things he had never dreamed of, and in return, he taught them about human crafts, machines, and the simple warmth of ordinary moments. And slowly, the fear he carried vanished. He no longer felt like a visitor. He became a part of their world, a familiar presence in the palace halls. Someone who mattered not because of titles, but because of the goodness he gave long ago. Years later, whenever someone asked the dragons why they kept a human so close, their answer was always the same. Because when we were small and the universe felt cold, he gave us warmth. And warmth is something you never forget. The mechanic never asked for glory, but he found something far more valuable, a family he never expected. a place he never imagined, and a story that began with kindness and ended with belonging.